The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly as Zeke Morrison dragged himself through the desert scrub, his right leg twisted and useless from the fall. His surveyor's instruments scattered across the canyon floor behind him. Blood seeped through his torn trousers, leaving a crimson trail on the parched earth. At 54, the former territorial land commissioner had mapped thousands of acres of frontier territory, prevented countless boundary disputes through precise measurements, and spent 26 years bringing order to the chaos of Western land claims. But he'd never expected to be pushed off a cliff by his own survey crew, betrayed for the crime of refusing to falsify property lines that would steal Apache sacred lands for a railroad company. "You're too honest for modern surveying, Morrison." Crew Chief Dalton had sneered as his hired thugs forced Zeke toward the precipice. The memory of Dalton's cold eyes burned in Zeke's mind as he crawled forward. This territory's got no use for commissioners who can't tell the difference between accuracy and progress. Zeke had stood his ground even as the men circled him like wolves. "There's no progress in theft, Dalton. Just greed wearing a fancy hat." The progress had been Dalton's scheme to redraw territorial boundaries, moving them several miles east to encompass a sacred Apache burial ground that the railroad wanted for a depot site. The land was protected by treaty, but treaties meant nothing to men like Dalton, who saw only dollar signs where others saw history and heritage. When Zeke discovered the fraudulent measurements and refused to sign the falsified maps, Dalton had decided that a tragic surveying accident would solve his problem permanently. "Should have stuck to measuring fence posts instead of measuring morals," Dalton had laughed as they sent Zeke tumbling into Devil's Backbone Canyon. "Maybe the rattlesnakes will appreciate your professional ethics." Now Zeke crawled through the thorny mesquite and prickly pear, his shattered legs screaming with each movement, his vision blurred from pain and the relentless desert heat. His throat burned with thirst, his lips cracked and bleeding. The sun beat down on his back like a hammer on an anvil, each blow weakening his resolve to survive. But something within him refused to surrender. Perhaps the same stubborn integrity that had gotten him thrown off that cliff in the first place. In the distance, he spotted smoke rising from a hidden valley. The first sign of life he'd seen since dragging himself away from the canyon floor. Hope flickered in his chest, fragile as a candle flame in a windstorm. With renewed determination, he pulled himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward that promise of salvation. The journey took hours, each movement a battle against pain and exhaustion. Twice he passed out, only to awaken to the same merciless sun and the same desperate situation. But the smoke remained, beckoning him forward when his body begged him to surrender. The ranch sat in a natural basin, surrounded by ancient cottonwoods and fed by a spring that created an oasis of green in the harsh desert landscape. A small adobe house stood at its center, with outbuildings arranged in a protective circle around a courtyard. Chickens scratched in the dirt, and a mule dozed in the shade of a lean-to. It wasn't grand, but to Zeke's parched eyes, it looked like paradise. Zeke collapsed at the wooden gate, his blood staining the carefully tended soil. His vision darkened at the edges as he fought to remain conscious. "Help!" he tried to call, but his voice emerged as little more than a rasp. The woman working in the vegetable garden looked up at his approach. Tall and strong, with black hair streaked with silver and dark eyes that held the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to survive in two worlds. Her face bore the fine lines of someone who'd spent decades under the desert sun, yet there was a timeless quality to her features, a blend of cultures that spoke of a complex heritage. She wore a mixture of Mexican and American clothing, and her weathered hands spoke of years spent working the unforgiving desert land. "Dios mío," she breathed, dropping her basket of freshly harvested vegetables and rushing to his side. "¿Qué te pasó?" Her voice carried both concern and caution. Life on the frontier had taught her that strangers could bring danger as easily as friendship. "Survey crew," Zeke gasped in broken Spanish, his tongue thick with dehydration. "Mi propia crew tried to kill me." He gestured weakly toward his mangled leg, where bone protruded through torn flesh. The woman, he'd later learn her name was Esperanza Espe Morales, studied him for a moment, her dark eyes assessing both his injuries and his character. Something in his face must have convinced her, for she nodded once and helped him toward her adobe house with surprising strength for someone of her build. Inside, the house was cool and dim, a blessed relief from the punishing sun. Her ranch was modest but well-maintained, with furnishings that blended Mexican craftsmanship with American practicality. Speaking of someone who honored both cultures, colorful woven blankets hung on the walls alongside carefully preserved maps and land deeds. A shelf held books in English, Spanish, and what Zeke recognized as Apache texts, rare possessions on the frontier. "Your own crew did this to your leg?" she asked in accented English, examining the damage with hands that moved with gentle expertise. She cleaned the wound with water from a clay pitcher, her touch firm but careful. "Caught them, falsifying maps," Zeke managed through gritted teeth as she worked. "Didn't appreciate my interference," he hissed as she probed the broken bone, fighting to remain conscious. SB's expression darkened with recognition. She'd seen this kind of systematic betrayal before, the calculated violence of men who used positions of authority to justify their theft. "Cabrones," she muttered, reaching for a bottle of amber liquid, always ready to steal what doesn't belong to them. She poured a measure of the liquor over his wound, and Zeke howled as liquid fire seemed to consume his leg. "Drink," she commanded, holding the bottle to his lips. "This will help with the pain while I set the bone." The whiskey burned down his throat, spreading warmth through his chest. As the alcohol dulled his senses, Espy worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she aligned the broken bones and splinted his leg with pieces of wood bound with strips of cloth. "You're lucky," she told him as she finished her work. "The bone broke clean. If infection doesn't set in, you might walk again." Her voice held no false promises, just the honest assessment of someone who understood both healing and harm. For 3 months, Zeke lay helpless while Espy tended his wounds with a mixture of frontier medicine and traditional Mexican remedies her grandmother had taught her. She made poultices of desert herbs to draw out infection, brewed teas of willow bark to ease his pain, and massaged his damaged muscles to prevent them from withering completely. His leg would never be straight again, too many bones had been shattered, but she managed to preserve enough function for him to walk with a cane and continue his work. During those long weeks of recovery, Zeke learned about his savior through fragments of conversation and careful observation. Espy moved through her daily tasks with quiet efficiency, tending her garden in the cool morning hours, working with leather and cloth during the heat of the day, and often disappearing at dusk to meet with visitors who arrived silently and departed the same way. When Zeke finally sat up clear-headed, he found Espy negotiating with a group of Apache leaders in her courtyard, conducting business in a mixture of Spanish, English, and Apache that demonstrated her role as a bridge between communities. She examined trade goods with a critical eye, haggled over prices with good-natured firmness, and settled disputes with the wisdom of a judge. Her ranch served as neutral ground where different peoples could meet safely, protected by her reputation for fairness and her skill with the rifle that never strayed far from her reach. "You speak Apache," he observed later, watching her work with natural diplomacy as she recorded the day's transactions in a leather-bound ledger. "I speak whatever builds understanding," Espy replied, examining a piece of turquoise jewelry with an expert eye before carefully wrapping it in soft cloth. "Out here, you learn to respect all peoples or you don't survive long." She glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "You're the first surveyor I've met who cared about accurate boundaries more than profitable ones." Her story emerged slowly over the following weeks, shared in quiet conversations as they sat in the courtyard, watching the desert sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. Espy was the daughter of a Mexican rancher and an Apache woman, raised in both worlds until the Indian Wars forced her to choose sides. She'd married an American surveyor who'd been killed in a deliberately caused rockslide when he'd tried to expose illegal land grabs, leaving her to survive with nothing but her knowledge of desert survival and her determination to protect what remained of her family's holdings. "Mexicans think I'm too Apache," she explained one evening, organizing her maps with scientific precision, that reminded Zeke of his own meticulous work. Americans think I'm too Mexican. Apache think I'm too white. I walk between three worlds and try to build bridges. Her hands moved confidently across the paper, marking boundaries and water sources with the skill of a trained cartographer. Your husband taught you surveying, Zeke observed, recognizing the professional quality of her work. He taught me the American way, SB corrected. My Apache grandfather taught me to read the land by the stars and the water flows. My Mexican father taught me to measure with ropes and stakes. Different methods, same purpose, knowing where you stand. Zeke told her about Dalton's conspiracy, the falsified surveys, the years of honest service repaid with treachery. He described the systematic corruption that had infected the Territorial Land Office, where bribes determined boundaries more often than actual measurements. SB listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if she'd heard similar stories before. This crew chief Dalton, she said finally, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He thinks maps are just lines on paper? He thinks I'm a fool for believing in accurate measurements, too rigid to understand that surveying is about serving whoever pays the most. Zeke's voice held the bitterness of betrayal, the anger of a man who dedicated his life to a principle only to be discarded when that principle became inconvenient. Maybe he's right about one thing, SB said, her tone thoughtful as she traced a boundary line with her finger. Maybe the old way of surveying is finished. Question is, what are you going to map to replace it? The question hung between them, challenging Zeke to look beyond his personal grievance toward a larger purpose. In that moment, something shifted in his understanding of his profession and his place in the territory. Their partnership began when a boundary dispute threatened to explode between Mexican ranchers and American homesteaders, with both sides claiming the same water rights based on conflicting surveys. The situation had already led to threats of violence, with cattle poisoned and warning shots fired across property lines. The territorial authorities had ignored the problem, considering it too minor for official intervention. Zeke's knowledge of territorial law and surveying techniques, combined with Espe's understanding of desert geography and traditional land use, allowed them to identify the true boundaries and design a solution that respected everyone's legitimate claims. They spent days measuring the land, researching old Spanish land grants, and interviewing elders from both communities about historical water usage. Their solution, a shared irrigation system with carefully scheduled water rights, satisfied both parties and prevented bloodshed. More importantly, it established their reputation as problem solvers who understood both the letter of the law and the practical realities of desert survival. You still know your trade? Espe observed as they watched the rival parties shake hands over a fair division of water rights, her voice carrying a note of respect that warmed Zeke more than the desert sun. No measurements, no legal descriptions, know how to read the land when maps lie, Zeke replied, leaning heavily on his walking stick, a gnarled piece of mesquite that Espe had carved to fit his hand perfectly. Out here, that's still worth something. Word spread through the Arizona territory about the ranch at Devil's Backbone Ridge, where Espe Morales and the crippled surveyor could solve problems that had stumped territorial authorities for years. Ranchers, miners, homesteaders, and tribal leaders sought their services, bringing disputes that ranged from simple boundary questions to complex water rights conflicts. They developed a reputation for fairness that extended from the Colorado River to the New Mexico border. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost: companionship, respect, and the slow-burning warmth of mature love, built on shared exile and mutual understanding. Their relationship grew naturally from their partnership, two people who had learned to value substance over appearance, integrity over convenience, and truth over comfort. The confrontation with crew chief Dalton came 2 years later, on a spring morning when wildflowers painted the desert in unexpected colors. Dalton arrived with territorial officials and forged documents, claiming Zeke was mentally incompetent due to his injuries and needed to be placed under company supervision. His real purpose was transparent: silencing the man whose testimony could expose his years of fraud. "There's the old cripple," Dalton announced, pointing at his former commissioner with a swagger that spoke of a man who believed money could buy any outcome. Living in squalor with some half-breed squaw, probably can't even read a compass anymore. Zeke emerged from the adobe house on his walking stick, no longer the broken man Dalton had pushed off the cliff. Hard work and purpose had strengthened his upper body, while finding his true calling had restored his spirit. His leg was twisted and weak, but his mind was sharp, and his voice carried the authority of genuine expertise. "Dalton," he said calmly, his eyes steady as he faced his would-be murderer. "You're looking prosperous. The fraud business treating you well? Don't get smart with me, Morrison. I'm here on official territorial business." Dalton waved a document bearing official seals, his confidence absolute. "These gentlemen are here to evaluate your mental competence. Seems you've been making wild accusations against respected businessmen." "Official." Espa stepped out beside Zeke, a rifle cradled in her arms with the casual comfort of someone who knew how to use it. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held the dangerous focus of a predator. "Funny thing about that. I sent some messages to friends in Phoenix and Santa Fe. Seems the territorial government's been investigating land fraud." Dalton's confidence wavered as he realized they'd been building a case against him for months. Espy's connections in the Mexican and Apache communities had provided access to witnesses and evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic boundary manipulation. Former crew members had testified about falsified surveys, intimidated landowners had come forward with stories of threats, and careful examination of land records had revealed patterns of fraud that couldn't be explained away. "This is a setup," Dalton sputtered, his hand moving toward his gun as his hired officials began to look uncomfortable. "No," came a new voice from the ridge above. "This is justice." Chief Cochise emerged from the rocks with a dozen Apache warriors, their faces painted for war. They'd been tracking Dalton's movements since learning of his plans to steal more sacred lands. The warriors carried rifles alongside traditional weapons, their expressions grim with the determination of men defending their ancestors' final resting places. "You want to steal our ancestors' bones?" Cochise called out in perfect English that surprised Dalton's officials. "Steal your own grave first." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Dalton's officials were outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just angry Apaches but federal investigators who'd been tracking his conspiracy for over a year. The territorial representatives looked nervously at each other, suddenly aware they might have aligned themselves with the wrong side. "This isn't over," Dalton snarled, backing toward his horse, his hand still hovering near his pistol. "Yes, it is," came another new voice. A federal marshal rode into the valley, flanked by territorial investigators and several angry railroad executives who'd discovered Dalton's plan to use their company as cover for his personal land grabs. "Ezekiel Morrison, we've been looking for you. Your testimony could help us put this snake behind bars." Dalton's empire crumbled quickly once federal authorities began examining his survey records and interviewing survivors of his accidents. His conspiracy had reached far beyond the Apache burial ground, involving systematic theft of lands belonging to Mexican families, Apache tribes, and American homesteaders across 3 territories. He died in territorial prison 18 months later, still claiming he'd only been trying to bring development to the frontier. "Feel better?" Espe asked as they watched the federal party disappear over the ridge, taking Dalton to face justice for his crimes. "Feel grounded," Zeke replied, adjusting his grip on his walking stick, his expression thoughtful. "For the first time since they crippled me, I feel like I'm protecting the land instead of just dividing it up." Their partnership deepened into something more profound than business or convenience. They established a surveying service that served the entire territory, providing accurate boundary determinations and advocacy for anyone whose land rights were threatened by fraud or corruption. Their methods blended traditional knowledge with modern techniques, creating maps that respected both legal requirements and cultural heritage. "We make quite a team," Espy observed one evening as they sat by the spring, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in brilliant purples and golds. A year of working together had created an understanding between them that went beyond words. a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "We make a foundation," Zeke corrected, taking her work-hardened hand in his scarred one. "The kind that's built on truth rather than lies, on respect rather than theft." He paused, searching for words to express what had grown between them. "I never expected to find a home out here, much less someone to share it with." Espy's smile held the warmth of understanding. Sometimes the best maps are the ones that lead us where we never planned to go. At 56, Ezekiel Morrison was no longer the broken-down commissioner who'd been pushed off a cliff by corrupt surveyors. He was a guardian of property rights, a protector of the dispossessed, and living proof that accurate measurements mattered more than profitable ones. His leg would always pain him, especially when storms approached, but he'd learned to see his disability not as weakness, but as a reminder of the price of integrity and its ultimate value. And Esperanza Morales had found something she'd thought impossible. Not just love, but professional partnership with someone who saw her mixed heritage as an asset rather than a liability, who understood that the strongest boundaries are built with respect for all the peoples who call the land home. Together, they'd created something neither could have built alone. A place where justice mattered more than power, where different cultures could find common ground, and where honest measurements created the foundation for peaceful coexistence. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in the stunning beauty of Arizona's desert country, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who draw the most accurate maps. Their ranch became a landmark on the frontier, Devil's Backbone Survey, where honest measurements and cultural understanding went hand in hand. The wagon trains still rolled past their valley, carrying settlers and dreams across the expanding West. But now they carried something else as well. The knowledge that there were still places where property rights mattered more than political connections, where broken legs couldn't break an unbreakable spirit, and where two people who'd been written off by the world proved that the most valuable surveys are those that map the human heart, measuring not just distance and direction, but dignity, respect, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to know exactly where they stand.